This is Nilanjana and I welcome you all to Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those who are joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies. As a part of this initiative, we host webinars every alternate Wednesday. We invite speakers from different domains who talk on subjects like front-end technologies, UI/UX, mobile apps, media, entrepreneurship, community building, digital marketing, and many more. In today's webinar, we will explore the tips, tricks, and methodologies that are effective in working with teams spread across geographical locations. Remote teams allow you to bring together the most talented individuals for a project, regardless of where they are based. But the time difference aside, there are several issues that might come up when team members are not at the same physical location. Our speaker today will talk about how to stay highly productive with such a distributed workforce. Our speaker for the day is Harrison Dunham. Harrison is a product engineer at Pantheon. He is a full-stack software engineer born and raised in Toronto and currently lives in San Francisco. He loves learning and making things both virtual and real. The more challenging, the better. When he's not building software, you can find him climbing mountains or surfing. Thank you, Harrison, for joining us today. Before you get hooked on to Harrison's presentation, I would request all participants to please type in any questions that you have during the presentation, and we'll take them up in the last 15 minutes of this session. Also, please don't forget to take this conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag StrigenWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us and Harrison in your tweets using our handles @Strigen and @IsTheBaron. So without taking up any more of your time, let's get started. Harrison, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Harrison, and I work at Pantheon, and we are a website management platform for both Drupal and WordPress sites based out of San Francisco. A little bit about me. I'm on the mission control team, and we're responsible for the system that makes the different pieces of the platform able to cooperate and communicate. We're a team of 4, and we're distributed. 2 of us are in San Francisco, 1 of us is in Cape Town, and 1 of us is in South Africa, and 1 of us is in Prague, in the Czech Republic. This is a map of where Pantheons are located. It's a little bit outdated now because we just picked up someone else in Europe. This talk is about how we've successfully built a distributed team that's both efficient and sane. Here we are in South Africa, and if it didn't work, we wouldn't have climbed a mountain together. So in this talk, I'm going to explain why I know my colleagues who are on the other side of the world better than I know some of my local colleagues, why I'm more productive from a cabin in northern Canada than from my desk in San Francisco, and why working with people on the other side of the world has made me better at long-distance relationships. And we call this distributed culture. But really, there's 3 secret ingredients which I will give to you now, and they are trust, empathy, and communication. So before we begin, let's just do a quick poll. How many people here are fully remote? And how many people here work from a separate office? And how many people work from home occasionally? Or how many people would like to? And so that does look like a lot of people, which is great, because this talk is about how to build a distributed team. But not only are there lessons here for teams with people who are not in the same office or in the same room, but also there's a lot of lessons here for teams of all local colleagues. And so before we begin, let's define what distributed culture is. Distributed systems, as a way of describing distributed culture, distributed systems are autonomous systems which by the nature of their implementation are more scalable and resilient to failure. They communicate and coordinate their actions by passing messages. On the other hand, a distributed team is a network of people who operate in different spaces and potentially in different time zones. However, a distributed team doesn't have to be that distributed or even full-time distributed. A distributed team can work from home 1 day a week, or they can work from across continents and time zones. And so what is distributed culture? We take that mental framework of working with distributed systems and apply it to working with distributed teams. We give autonomy to teams and colleagues so that they can function independently in space and time, and then you want to begin to ingrain that in the company culture, from how to distribute work, from how to conduct meetings, and to how to actually execute on the work. And so why would you want to do this? So here's a quote from Melvin Conway, which I'm not going to read, but Melvin Conway was an early computer scientist and hacker well known for his seminal paper on coroutines, which is one of the backbones of modern computing. And to paraphrase, communication structures of organizations directly impact communication structures of systems. What that means is that the mental framework required to run a distributed team is similar to the one required to run a distributed system. This includes a stronger focus on planning, such that people are afforded the freedom to organize their work and their personal lives responsibly. And as anyone who can attest who has impromptu meetings, context switching is extremely expensive. Distributing a team also forces you to think about the approach of how you work, the process of work. And this means that there will be more persistent communication and better documentation, which leads to less flow interrupt for local and remote employees. However, as communication moves asynchronous and away from in-person and face-to-face and over a desk, it becomes harder to ask what something is, what something does, or where something is located. And so again, while there's wins here for a team of all remote employees or all local employees, really anybody can benefit from having better documentation and some of the lessons in this presentation. And so why would you want to distribute your team? And so let's say you work at a company that works with hardware or software or customers, and as we know, these things tend to get unhappy. Some and so let's say you get a high value, support ticket from your customer who you have to respond to immediately, or let's say a service gets tangled in a knot and you're asleep. You've got to respond to the page. You've got to get a laptop. You've got to wake up. You've got to get up to speed on the state of the system. And then you've got to start to build a narrative out of the alerts and the pages and make sense of the symptoms. And then if you're out of your depth, you've got to wake your colleagues up. And all of this takes time. And what's worse is that some of these problems can get worse with time. And so a faster response saves a lot of grief. And if these things happen while you're awake, you can see alerts as they happen, you're context aware, and you're already at a laptop with an awake team. So even if you need to wake someone up, you can build the narrative as you see it happening, which will speed resolution. And the end result is highly available colleagues for highly available systems. And that's not only for emergencies, but again, it's also for support tickets, for example. You can achieve follow-the-sun support if you distribute your team. And so that means that customers in distant time zones will have faster resolutions, and they'll ultimately be happier. And so to assist with this, and I'll go into the tools in a little bit, but at Pantheon we have 2 pager duty shifts, one for the Pacific daytime hours and one for the Central European daytime hours. And this means that now someone is rarely woken up, and ultimately everybody's a lot happier. Another reason why we'd want to distribute your team is that commuting can take a lot of time. So for example, the average commute time in the States is about 30 minutes. And let's say you add 15 minutes each way, like getting ready to commute, like getting into your car, finding parking, whatever, getting on your bike. So that works out to about 1.5 hours a day or 7.5 hours a week. And over the course of the year, if you take 3 weeks of vacation, that's 370 hours. 370 hours is also a little bit more than 3 weeks. So that means you're spending more time commuting than you are on vacation. That's crazy. So by cutting down on the commute, that directly translates to more time with friends, family, hobbies, being outside, doing what you love, etc. That also frees you to work on your schedule more. So if you're an evening person, if you're a morning person, you can find the hours that you're most productive and maximize those. And all of this, again, leads to happier employees and colleagues. And so, for example, I have a good friend in San Francisco whose girlfriend lived in Hawaii, and that resulted in at least 10 hours in the air every other weekend flying to see her, not to mention hundreds of dollars in plane tickets. He was actively searching for a new job until his current company allowed him the opportunity to work remote from Hawaii 2 weeks a month. And so they created a lot of loyalty with him, and they kept a great engineer, and ultimately he was a lot happier. Another reason why you should consider distributing a team is that recruiting and onboarding employees are extremely expensive, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time and the opportunity cost. What's more is losing a colleague's ingrained knowledge is even more expensive. And so why lose colleagues when they need to move for non-work related reasons, such as chasing a university sweetheart to San Francisco, for example? Needing to move houses due to life circumstance shouldn't require you to move. And so distributing your team affords employees nomadic freedom, which again will not only make them happier, but improve retention across the board. Little caveat there, though, is that it's important not to skimp on salaries, as tech salaries outside of tech hubs go a long way. And so instead of thinking about how much or little money you're saving, think about how you're building loyalty with someone. And what's more is local employees local employees will know that they're getting a much better deal than if they were to take a job that wasn't distributed. This in turn will make them harder to poach. And employees are some of your most valuable resources, so you should do what you can to keep them. I have another friend who had the dream of living out of a bus traveling North America while keeping his job. His company let him take a MiFi across the country so that he could live out his dream, and ultimately he stayed at his company. And so again, they kept a really strong engineer, built loyalty, and he got to live out his dream. And another reason why you should consider distributing your team is that on top of recruiting, again, onboarding is expensive. And so this map shows the location of tech companies across the world. So why limit your candidate pool to just the dot in which your company resides? Being constrained to one location means you're obligated to compete aggressively for talent in a potentially tiny pool. And what's more is you're also chaining your employees to where you're located. And so let's say you have to move offices. Well, that requires all of your employees to move houses as well, which significantly disrupts their life. Even if it's not that much of a move, it could significantly disrupt their commute, which again impacts their life in a big way. And so you want to minimize that so you can improve retention. So now that we've talked about sort of why you would want to consider building a distributed team, let's get into the where and the when, and then we'll actually get into the toolbox that Pantheon uses to manage our distributed teams. And so distribution can happen across town, or it can happen across time zones. And with all things, there's a cost-benefit trade-off from where you choose to work. And so, for example, there's benefits and there's risks. And working from home, there's mild risk, but there's also milder benefits. Working from co-working spaces provides a higher social health than working from home. There's better motivation. And it's a good balance between working from home and working from an office. As you can choose the location, you can choose the time that you go to it. And if you work from a home office, your van, your boat, your plane, your spaceship, whatever, sure, there's higher freedom, but it's also much more challenging to stay motivated. And so when should you start? Well, culture grows over time, and by starting early, you've got a better chance of baking distributed work into it. And there will always be an excuse not to do it, but the beauty is that you don't have to commit entirely to it right away. And in fact, committing entirely to it right away is a sure way to fail. It's a big change, and so you have to give yourself some time to adapt. Start small as a first step. Maybe start work from home Wednesday, and then make it mandatory to work from home 1 day a week. And this builds empathy for remote workers and starts to make it a cultural norm. This image is the orbit chart for Salyut 6, the Soviet space station in the late 70s, initially laid out to show the full 96-day flight path. The cosmonauts hung it up on the wall and were quickly driven mad by it constantly reminding them of how much longer they had to go until they returned to Earth. It shows the 1,500 sunrises and sunsets that they would experience. And so ultimately, they shortened it into 2-week chunks, first counting into the voyage and then counting down from the voyage until they returned to Earth. So as with spaceflight and living in orbit, it's important to start small with incremental steps and build from there. Because committing to a substantial remote policy without any prior experience is a sure way to encounter failure and resistance. And if it can work for cosmonauts in orbit, it can definitely work for you working from your living room. So that's cool. So now let's start to talk about how to make it work. Let's start to talk about the toolbox and how to begin to distribute work. So there are some kinds of work that are better suited to remote colleagues and some kinds of work that are better suited to local colleagues. And the key in finding success is leveraging the pros and cons of each to find a harmonious balance. At Pantheon, we've seen that work tends to be either iterative with a high frequency of changes, such as feature development, or it's slow and monolithic, such as re-architecting the platform to increase testability and reliability. And I'm sure for every industry, there's a similar kind of trade-off here, or similar kind of work distribution. The optimal environments for each of these differ greatly. For example, in a highly iterative environment, distractions are less expensive and constant communication is very important. And so we tend to assign this kind of work local to the product team, since interrupt is less expensive and communication is so much more necessary. Local teams, the stakeholders, are extremely accessible, and so this works out really well. Conversely, if the nature of work is engineering-centric, such as re-architecting the platform, then remote colleagues can be afforded more autonomy. Typically, being remote can mean less back and forth than being local, especially when you're dealing with different time zones, and again, this leads to less interrupt, which leads to more heads down time, which can make someone more productive. Either way, communication is imperative. And so when you rarely see someone, communication becomes immensely important. And the quality of your relationship, both in work and in love, is directly correlated to the quality of your communication. At Pantheon, we've seen that communication generally takes place in two forms, synchronous and asynchronous. For synchronous communication, our toolbox includes Slack, a pretty sweet and extensible chat application that we can put plugins in and whatnot. We conduct our formal communication here, but we've also set up water cooler rooms, rooms that are designed for informal conversations, such as sharing Justin Bieber's new album, or off-topic discussions, or general link sharing. We also have a stand-up room, which lets us measure the pulse of remote colleagues in a really lightweight form, and we can see what everybody is up to. We also make heavy use of GitHub's HuBot, a chat room robot. By augmenting him with custom scripts, we can perform actions on our servers, we can see who's on call, browse endpoints, or generate memes, all by typing commands in a public chat. Not only does this leave a persistent record of some of the operations we perform on the platform, but it helps us implicitly learn from one another, especially when reading how someone else was able to diagnose a problem or solve something. For meetings and whatnot, we use Hangouts with a Polycom. This is a screenshot from my team's Monday meetings, which are engineering early in the day in San Francisco, or late evening in the Central European time zone. And this is necessitated by having people both on the west coast of the States and in South Africa and in Europe. Company-wide meetings have speaker setups so the remote colleagues have as much of a voice as local counterparts. And we even have widescreen webcams, as you can see here. And so it's not just faceless voices, but you can see how people are reacting, and you can see who's speaking and whatnot. We also have microphones that are hooked up to Hangouts if there's going to be a lot of attendees, so that attendees can hear questions and discussions that happen in the headquarters. We've converged on this meeting setup after months of painful audiovisual experiments. Sometimes short-form Hangouts and text just aren't enough, though. And so when you're working with a colleague for an extended period of time, communication can be made that much better for setting up a video call for the course of the day. And so here's myself and a coworker. We're in separate rooms, but we're working on the same problem. And by having a video chat with him for the course of the problem, it was like we were sitting beside each other solving this thing. So Appear.in is a service that lets you create ad hoc video calls one-on-one with colleagues. And we found in terms of performance that it works better for longer calls, but it also uses less CPU, which is great when you're working on computationally intensive tasks. Asynchronous communication is much easier to handle. So in addition to emails, we have a pretty strict pull request process, and we use Sprintly tickets and Waffle.io. Waffle.io is a GUI built on top of GitHub issues, which makes it easier to see how stories are related and see sort of the general narrative arc of what we're working on. As the GitHub issues, as their own, is a little bit unintuitive, and it can be difficult to convey these things. You can also treat these things as sticky notes, but when we actually need sticky notes, and maybe instead of whiteboarding, we use another tool, stickies.io. And so now, having experienced Monday meetings from our headquarters in San Francisco's Chinatown, a colleague's living room in Cape Town, Helsinki, Barcelona, etc., I can say that this is a great setup. As I previously mentioned, we also use PagerDuty to manage the on-call schedule. If there are alerts or infrastructure failures or emergency tickets, this will let us know. This is a great tool to formalize incident management, and the two schedules that I've included on this slide show both the US shift as well as the EU shift. And again, they're offset by 12 hours, so someone's got my back while I'm asleep, and I've got my colleagues' back while they're asleep, and so that we can sleep soundly through the night, which is fantastic. Again, another tool, statuspage.io, which is a great way to manage communication with customers across the world in real time so that they don't have to open a support ticket to see what the status of the system is. As someone at Pantheon says, the best support ticket is one that's never opened. We can also communicate incidents and notices, as well as there's historical graphs and status updates, so that if you're meaning to look at something, you can, and it's quite easy, even back a couple days. And all of this further emphasizes that in order to maintain a healthy work relationship and personal relationship, trust and communication are key. So that's all good, right? Like now you have a toolbox for communicating effectively via text, audio, and video, but sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes you have to bring people on site. And so at Pantheon, we bring both employees and customers on site occasionally. For employees, we do this when they first come on, and then again a couple times a year. And we stress meeting for a period of about 3 weeks per visit for those coming from a long way away, or someone a little bit closer, and they come once a quarter, then maybe 1 week a quarter is enough. When someone comes on site, we take it as an opportunity to have intensive meetings and discussions, and this can take the form of training and onboarding, as in the case of new employees, or it can take the form of intensive planning discussions such as architectural reviews, road mapping, cross-team discussions, things that are really difficult to facilitate over video and chat. As far as new customers go, a lesson that we learned from distributing our team is that we have very extensive documentation, which can answer most questions. But if we deem it necessary, depending on the team size, they either come on site or we send a couple people to their office to go onboard them. However, in work and in love, a working relationship only takes us so far. We're social creatures, and it's easy to get sucked into lapses of low morale or cabin fever, and it's especially important for remote colleagues who have to be accountable and self-managing and self-motivated. This is necessary so that the company can continue to row in one direction at the same time, and it's difficult for remote colleagues as they don't have the social environment of the office. When you don't interact with your team regularly, it's important to find fulfilling interaction elsewhere. And so at this point, finding groups of people who share an interest in your location and what you do is incredibly important. Co-working spaces tend to be very good at this, since a lot of people in co-working spaces aren't working at larger companies, or they're working remotely. But there's other resources as well, such as meetup.com, sports teams, clubs, your local jazz choir, etc. Even so, it's important to know your colleagues well. So not only do we have intense discussions when we come on site, as I just mentioned, but when someone comes on site, we also take the opportunity to take them out on the weekends and in the evenings and build a more personal relationship than what GitHub issues allow. So for example, at our latest team meetup in August, where my good friend here in the photo came on site, as well as my other friend in Prague, we went to the famous California redwoods and spent the day walking through the trees and just catching up and talking. And then, as you saw in the second slide, when we met in Cape Town, he took us up Table Mountain. Establishing a personal connection is incredibly important, and not only for general happiness, but also for those inevitable late nights, so that you know who you're working with, and you know that the person you're working with will have your back, even though they could literally be on the other side of the world, as San Francisco and Cape Town are. But so as it is rewarding, it's also risky, and so let's talk about some of the risks. You've got to learn to trust your colleagues and employees to actually do the work, and that's a question that comes up quite a bit. It's easier when you see them every day, but the reality is, if they're not going to work, then they wouldn't even work if they were local. If you can't trust someone to work, then why trust them with company credentials and secrets? Distributed teams have to be clear about wanting to do the work, as their ties to the company are a little bit looser. And so working for a company becomes more of a choice. And so if someone chooses to leave, that's maybe not necessarily such a bad thing. And this, would be the case where someone just doesn't show up when you need them. Maybe they lose steam, and so by leaving, they can ultimately increase everybody else's happiness and productivity, so you don't have to drag them along. Employees who are remote are also keenly aware of this, and so they know that they have to do the work, and they have to have responsibility for when they're needed. Sometimes there are connection circumstances out of their control, though, as in the case, for example, in South Africa, where they turn the power off sometimes for hours at a time. And that's another reason to build inter-team empathy and to build trust with someone when they come on site. Security is also incredibly important for distributed teams, and at this I'd recommend looking into two-factor authentication for important sites such as Google Apps and GitHub, and also setting up a VPN for some of your internal websites is imperative. Or else, if you're more engineering-minded, you can get developer certs and get some sites to only accept your cert if you're using your work machine. At Pantheon, furthermore, we use YubiKeys, which are little USB devices that contain private keys so that you can only access servers if you have the key plugged into your machine and you know the passcode. And so this means that even though our employees are quite literally spread across the planet, you can't access the servers if you don't have one of these keys. And so we know who is accessing the server at any one time, we know where they're coming from. As I previously mentioned, we are social creatures, and it's important to keep morale high. And so again, it's important to find social fulfillment and, importantly, routine outside of work. So building a routine, even if it's a loose one, will help someone from going crazy. And finally, ambiguous feedback should be clarified, and passive-aggressive, snippy comments should be nipped right in the bud. And this is why we really use lots of our communication at Pantheon involves emoji, because it's so much easier to convey sentiment behind the message than just text. Again, with work and in love, when communication deteriorates, the quality of the relationship deteriorates. And so here are a couple of resources, and the slides will be going out after this, but here are a couple of resources that you may find helpful if you're thinking about beginning a distributed team, or if you want more information. But in summary, the wins are numerous for both employees and employers. Colleagues, employees ultimately will have more freedom in how they choose to live their lives, which will make them more productive and happier. Work becomes a part of life, and you blend work and life responsibly. It's not for everyone, and it can be extremely difficult, and it can be risky, but it's also immensely rewarding. It encourages a higher rate of retention, which translates to more savings and more happiness. Thank you. And now I will take questions.
Thank you, Harrison. That was a really short and crisp presentation on how we can deal with working with a distributed workforce. Since a few of our attendees joined in a little late, would you mind giving us a quick recap of how it is to work in what are the benefits of working in a distributed team?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, building a distributed team results in a better work-life balance as you can start to cut down on commute time. And I guess it kind of takes, there's two categories of benefits. One is for a company and one is for the colleague or the employee. And so for the colleague or the employee, you can start to cut down on commute time, which gives you more time to do what you love. And it also gives you nomadic freedom, and so you can move cities or move houses without necessarily having to change jobs. In terms of the company, it inspires a higher rate of retention since you don't lose people who need to move for life circumstances. And then you can also allow people to, since you allow people to work on hours who or like find hours where they're most productive, you get more productive employees who ultimately end up being happier. What's more is that if you distribute across time zones, you can start to get it's less painful, shall I say, to build highly available systems. And so if something, let's say, breaks in the middle of the night, or if someone important calls in the middle of the night because they're experiencing some problem, then you don't have to get woken up. And again, this leads to a higher rate of satisfaction for colleagues, and also a shorter turnaround time for resolving issues.
All right, thank you for that quick recap. We have a couple of questions coming in now. So the first one is from Alex Kristen, and he says hi. He's actually met you in Cape Town and wishes you well. So his question is, how do you guys go about finding talent overseas?
Hey Alex, thanks for tuning in. Um, so what we've done in the past is most of us have come from larger companies where people have been on site from like other countries, and then they want a change of pace, or they want like a different lifestyle or whatever, and so they maybe move home or move to another country. Uh, so when we go about finding someone, we look for people who we know are solid, and then we start with them. And then so as you start to build these like little networks spread across the planet, that's the power of the networking effect, right? So then you can let's say, so like I definitely trust my South African colleague, and so if he would to recommend someone, I'd be like, hey, this guy is serious. Like let's treat him as if we were to treat someone who we found locally, right? And we treat it seriously.
All right. Our next question is, how do you deal with different local laws for employees, and how do you handle payments to them?
So Pantheon is headquartered in the States, and again, um, this really depends on where your company is based. So I can only speak to what happens in the States, but when we hire remote colleagues, they end up being contractors just because it's easier in terms of taxes and whatnot. Um, and it's important to like definitely not skimp on looking into the legalities of how to pay someone. Like the consequences for messing up are immense, and really it's like not that difficult. Does that kind of answer the question?
I'm sure that would answer the question pretty well. The next question is, can distributed teams really replace the productivity of working together on site?
Absolutely, yeah. My team is of four, and we've done some immensely difficult engineering tasks. And in fact, it's been like one of the big things that had to get done was re-architecting part of the platform, for example. And if you were to do that with a local team, they would constantly be interrupted all the time, either by meetings or by emails or people just like coming up to their desk to, I don't know, say hi or something. Or like, when you see someone, there's the temptation to drag them away from what they're doing to help you. And so we gave that work to the remote half of our team, who doesn't get interrupted because their working hours are when we're asleep. And so they ended up being far more productive doing this re-architecting than we were if we were to do it locally. It's a little bit harder when you start to think about feature management and like feature development when like a remote colleague is separated from the product team, but it's still definitely very possible, as that's what's happening right now.
All right, that said, the next question is, since in your presentation you stressed on documentation as being a core part of remote team working, don't you think a miscommunication would while preparing the documentation would create more issues?
Um, the point of, I guess, documentation is that you don't just like write it and leave it there. It's like you're probably working with someone. And there's this concept of the bus factor, which you can look into, but you don't really ever want to have a team of just like one person who like only one person knows what's going on. And so if you're going to write documentation, it should probably be reviewed by at least a couple other people, especially for like mission critical systems. And then at that point, any ambiguity or confusion could be clarified before it's like immortalized in a wiki page.
All right. So this question is what the most difficult part while working with a remote team could be trust issues. So how is it possible to overcome the fear of a data leakage?
How is it possible to overcome the fear of what, pardon?
A fear of data leaking.
Oh, yeah. So again, it's trust. Trust is a big issue here. That's part of why it's immensely important for everybody to meet each other when someone comes on site or when someone comes on board for the first time. In terms of like if if data were to accidentally leak, we can try and minimize that by and so that would be like someone hopping on to servers and like taking information. And so that's why we have YubiKeys in that like you can only connect to servers with these physical pieces of hardware, which means that again only our trusted employees have them. If someone were to be malicious and try and try and leak data, like there's like that could happen with someone local as well, right? And so it's really not that different. Even though you don't necessarily see someone every day, it doesn't mean that you should not trust them.
The next question is, would companies accept candidates for remote projects if they do not have a passport? As in, are passports mandatory due to some legal issues, or is it just a company-specific policy?
I am not sure of that. I think that would really depend on where the company is located. I think, as far as I know, for working for a remote company in the States, you don't have to have a passport. Like in terms of the legality, again, if an American company hires someone, and so the visa situation is different everywhere, granted, but it's just like you would hire a contractor, and then the contractor, and I'm air quoting here, the contractor sort of manages their own company, right? And so you hire like your remote colleague through their company that they're creating. But again, that could be, and so they don't need a passport as far as I know, but that could be different for other countries.
The next question is whether asking for a report at the end of the day is helpful and appreciated by remote staff or those who work from home, like a combined document of what was done by everybody all throughout the day. Is it something that would prove to be helpful in a remote team scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So in software engineering, there's this idea of agile development, and so that means that every day, at some point, the team gets up and they discuss what they've been doing, and they discuss what they did yesterday, and if they're blocked by anything. And so really, and as I mentioned in the slide on Slack, when we've set up the stand-up room, we just type really lightweight updates like, hey, I've been doing this, today I'm going to do this, and I'm blocked by this. And so anybody can go in there and so they can see, oh, like, Harrison has been working on this. And so they don't necessarily have to ask me what I'm doing to know what I'm doing. And that's how software, for the most part, in San Francisco happens. And so remote colleagues, I feel definitely do appreciate the stand-up room.
The next question is more about the communication issues. So it's sometimes the case that when on a Skype call, people are usually generally quiet and not very interactive as compared to when they're face to face. So is there some strategy or tricks that we can use for people to be more communicative on a video call?
Again, it comes down to like when someone comes on site. Well, so there's like the hiring process. Like so, what you look for in terms of the personality for remote colleagues is a little bit more is more of a superset of like personality traits, right? So you need someone who is self-motivated and they're driven, and who's very good at communication. And that's really thrown into the spotlight when you only interact with someone via text or like a video call or an audio call, whereas um, maybe that's a little bit less important for someone who's local since they might come out of their shell more in person. But when hiring someone, it's really important to look for those kinds of things. Um, and I would not be the one to explain how to build how to reinforce those personality traits. But really, yeah, it just comes down to like the hiring process.
Okay, so the next question is how much time did you personally take before you felt that a remote team is much better and productive than a normal team in the same physical space?
Um, I think it became apparent pretty quickly, actually. So I've worked at like a couple different companies. Of like all local colleagues, and again like we tried to do like these initiatives of like rebuilding something, and it was hard because we kept getting interrupted. But everybody at Pantheon is fairly mature, and we think about like before we do anything, we think about like, all right, well, like what are the benefits of doing this, what are the risks of doing this. And so as we started to talk about building a distributed team, we started to think about, okay, like what are the key differences here, and how can we leverage that to become a strength? Um, and so it, it it took a little bit of time just to like verify that that was the case. But then once we found it, that's definitely we've definitely found that to be true.
Thank you, Harrison. At this point, if our attendees have any more questions, I would request them to please type in. And while our participants type in their questions, Harrison, would you have any more insights that you would like to share?
Uh, no, I mean if you've got any questions that you don't wanna have read out over the webinar, feel free to email me or tweet at me. Email is obviously more confidential, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got. And my email is right there on the slide.
All right, so we haven't received any more questions at this point. So I think we are getting one more question, so I would just wait for maybe a few more minutes to let it come in.
Cool.
I'm sorry, I think this is a question that's getting repeated. So
Yeah, I can answer it again. What's the question?
uh, it's the same question about people not being interactive on a video call. So if you have anything more you could share on that, or something that you have found really useful when people are not being as communicative on a video call.
So yeah, I guess so. Yes, it is. You have to look for these personality traits in someone who's going to be remote. You have to look for the willingness to communicate. But then everybody has off days, I guess, and so like on the day to day, if someone's not really being interactive, you can just involve them, or you can like explicitly ask them like, hey, like what's your opinion on this? Like, what do you think?
All right, thank you for patiently answering all our questions.
Cool,
Uh,
thank you.
all right, we have one more question that's just come in. So this question is more about some sudden developments. Like the question is, if you have a remote member who you trust, but there's suddenly a situation where he goes missing, or probably what he's not responsive. So what do you do in such a case, or how do you handle the project in such a case?
Um, so again, there are circumstances outside of like someone's control for reason like as an example in South Africa, they turn off the power for 3 hours at a time. because there's not enough power to power the whole country. And we didn't really appreciate that and empathize until we actually went down there and experienced it. Um, and so like we know that he's going to be back online when he can, but in terms of the work, like we know that it's going to have to wait. If I mean, I guess if there was something more like extraneous to happen, like that could happen to anybody, anywhere. And so there's this idea of the bus factor, right? Like you don't want to have only one person who knows how a critical piece of the system works. In terms of managing deadlines, that's also why it's extremely rare for a project to go ahead with only one person.
All right. We have another question coming in, which is any specific piece of advice that you would have for an distributed team that's working with IT, and what would be an ideal setup for working with a remote team? The critical pieces of software or the critical pieces of communication or tools that you would need in order to set up a remote working environment.
Yeah, so um, let's um, So, I mean, like, you want to think about synchronous communication, you want to think about asynchronous communication. And so, through these slides and this slide deck will go out a little bit later. These are I think these are all websites except for Slack, actually. Yeah, these are all websites. That's crazy, except for Slack, that we use to communicate. In terms of, like, if you want to pair with someone on something, uh, obviously like Google Docs is pretty sweet if you need to like write up some draft, or there's this like shell command Tmux or Teammate, Tmux or Teammate, which lets that's almost like Google Docs for the shell, which is pretty powerful. And then you can also look into cloud IDEs if you need to pair like more tangibly. But yeah, that's how we communicate and work together.
All right. The next question is, how can a startup set up distributed team members with a shoestring budget? Are there any specific strategies that a startup could apply?
Um, Let me think about that. No, I mean, ultimately, what you're trying to build is an efficient and sane team, and so it doesn't really make sense to cut corners in places, like not bring someone on site, because, like, and I think maybe that's kind of what this question is getting at, because otherwise, like hiring someone somewhere else, like that's really no different than hiring someone locally, and these tools are relatively cheap, and like the big expense is bringing someone on site. But if you don't bring someone on site, like you don't build that personal relationship. And so if you have to work closely with someone who you've never met before, it can be a little bit more difficult than if you like work closely with someone who you've met and you have this relationship, um, and they have your back and they know that you have theirs. So I would really not recommend skimping uh, on bringing someone.
All right. Thank you for the answer. At this point, I don't see any more questions coming in. I would once again request our attendees, if they have any more questions, please type them in for to us. We would wait probably another minute or two to see in if any more questions are coming in. All right, we have one
Cool.
more. Did you face any challenge till now while working with a distributed team? If yes, how did you handle it?
I mean, it can always be difficult when like you're working. So yeah, we've tried to do tight iterative feature work with a team made up of like the product team is in the headquarters in San Francisco, and then other employees are like shifted by time zones and whatnot. Um, and just because like the time delay in communication, we've found that like really breaks down and make things inefficient. Um, and so that's where we started to think about like what is someone's circumstance, and like what would what kind of project would be more effective when done by someone who is remote versus local. And so it's really just like changing the mental framework of how we've been thinking about assigning work and actually doing work.
All
I
right.
guess another suggestion would be so I'm thinking of the support team, for example, and we have a team in the Philippines now, uh, and so they've become like this little self-sufficient cluster of people who are fully functional, even though they may not necessarily talk to anybody in headquarters for the space of a day. Um, they know exactly what they have to do and they know exactly how to do it. And again, so that requires like intensive training for like a period of like 2 to 3 weeks, and then a little bit of guidance and mentorship. But then they can sort of hit the ground running, which is pretty great.
Thank you. So, this is one question that I personally have about a distributed team. Is that from all that you have said, so what comes out is that the most critical thing to remember when working or hiring for a distributed, the critical piece is that the kind of people you hire. Am I right? So, what are the kind of specific qualities that you should look for in a person that you know is being hired for a distributed team project?
Self-motivating, responsible, driven, very communicative. Uh, And as I said in the beginning, like the three secret ingredients for success, right, are you want to have good communication, you want to have empathy with people, and then you want to be able to trust them. And so personality traits that contribute towards that are what we look for.
Thank you, Harrison. And I think now we are moving towards the end of the webinar. I would again repeat my request if our attendees have any more questions to please type them in.
And if you've got like, questions that you don't want to be read out loud, like feel free to email me.
All right, looks like we do not have any more questions coming in. So thank you, Harrison, for leading such an engaging and insightful webinar. And I'm sure everyone found your presentation very insightful, and all of our listeners who are working with remote teams will go back with some new tricks up their sleeve. Also, if our listeners have any more questions, they can send it in by mailing it to us at webinars@srijan.in. So a big thank you to all our attendees for joining us today. You all have been a great audience. I would also like to announce that our next webinar is on Drupal 8, the crash course. It would be hosted on 2nd December and it would be led by Larry Garfield, Senior Architect and Community Lead at Palantir. So with that, we come to the end of today's webinar and I would like to thank once again both our speaker, Harrison, and all our listeners. Thank you for joining us today.